Hello and welcome to today's impactful conversation with myself, Nejmi Alexander, and my wonderful co-host, Dr. Glenn Wallis. Glenn, how are you doing?
I'm very good, Nejmi. Thank you. Yeah, really good. How are you?
Yes, I'm good. Fresh off a fair amount of travel over the past week or two, but feeling fresh and raring to go on today's topic. Actually, today's topic is a little bit informed by some of those travels because the topic of delegated authority, how to encourage people to step up into their leadership within an organization, within your teams, is something that's come up multiple times in recent days and weeks, and so I was feeling inspired from those travels to bring that into our conversation today to really unpack firstly, like what does it mean, but also what are the things that can contribute towards people stepping up, what are the things that can erode or get in the way of people stepping up, and also it's a nice build on our recent conversation on this idea of stepping in and stepping out. Now we're creating space for people to step up, and how can we do that really effectively?
Yeah, I agree. I think there's the previous episode was which I would highly recommend people go back to listen to if they haven't already done so, because I do see these as very much a sort of joint. That we haven't positioned them as a joint episode, but really they are two parts of the same whole. And I think we talked about stepping in and stepping out of leadership space last time, and this idea of, well, the precursor to that needs to be that people have got the permission and the platform to actually do that. And so how do you create that expectation, but also the opportunity for people to do that? And I think it's worth exploring before we dive in. Why, if I was a leader sitting, listening to this, or out on a walk listening to this, as I know several people do, why would I bother to create the opportunities to delegate authority? What's your, you've, like I do, coached lots of leaders over the course of a year. When you see this emerge as a topic that people want some coaching on, what are the benefits of it, or what are they looking for, where this then becomes the solution?
So brilliant start. I think usually when this topic comes up in my work, it's more from an organizational or from a leadership team, consideration or query, that they're seeing this symptom. They've set an expectation across leaders, managers within their teams or within the organizations that they're expecting to see different leadership behaviors or higher performance from that leadership community in terms of how they lead, but they're not seeing people step into that space and really embody the expectations of the organization or of the senior leadership. And the reason why it's important to nail this as a behavior or as a capability within your leadership is, frankly, that contributes when you're able to do this really well, when you're able to delegate authority effectively. You're building leaders, right? You're building other leaders within your teams to solve for more of the problems that you are typically stepping into the fold to solve. And so the benefit for you as a leader, of course, is freeing up a little bit more space for you to focus on the strategic or higher level challenges, the bigger, bolder challenges within your remit, within your responsibility, and also within your development. Right, it gives you space for you to develop too. Fundamentally enables the benefits of creating leaders or creating more. The capability for a wider set of problems to be solved by other people than you, right? Loosening up a bottleneck, which is what is really, really important about sort of nailing that as a skill.
Yeah, I think I agree with it. So I think in summary, there are loads of reasons why you would want to create an environment where authority is delegated effectively. And I think one of the things that we need to maybe look at first is, what are the conditions that help create that ability to delegate authority effectively? What's likely to need to be in place? And I would just kick something off. In preparation for this, I was thinking around some of the topics you and I had spoken about. But one of the things that delegated authority presupposes is that whoever is the leader in whatever the context is that we're talking about is willing to delegate authority, right? I mean, we know a lot of leaders who won't delegate tasks, let alone thinking about delegating authority. So I think there is a real challenge for leaders here. Again, in lots of the work you and I do one-to-one with leaders, some of the challenge for new leaders particularly is that willingness to let some control as they see it go. And I think one of the precondition or the precondition to being able to delegate authority is that the leader who is about to do that needs to be willing to do it, comfortable to do it, have confidence in the team to do it. But I think it starts with whoever's about to delegate. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely, 100%. And actually, when I work with teams or work with organizations and this comes up as a topic, I see it as incumbent in my role as a coach or as anyone that's supporting them around leadership development to hold up the mirror, to ask why, as a leadership team, do you believe that this is not being reflected back from the leaders within your teams? Because absolutely, it is typically the root cause of not seeing delegated authority is control. And I think that is control being sort of relinquished to an extent by those with the most power or authority within the organizations.
I was listening to a podcast yesterday. I just must drop this phrase in, which I heard only yesterday. I was listening to a podcast about politics, which is not. I won't even go there. But I was listening to a podcast on politics, and they used the phrase "control freakery," which I thought was an interesting idea. That control freakery gets in the way of so much good stuff happening. And if you're a leader who falls foul of control freakery, delegated authority is going to be harder for everyone to step into, right?
Right. So that's your first sort of question to consider, dear listener, is how what's your quotient of control freakery that might be contributing towards this delegated authority or not? Yeah. I think absolutely. That that's the starting point. As a leader, how willing or capable, able are you to relinquish control, and when, in order to build more leadership within those around you, within your teams. 100%. That's absolutely a function. And I think that's why this topic in particular is so interesting, because getting it right is a function of trust in your people, trust in the outcomes, trust in the way you navigate, being very precise or prescriptive about the expectation, so that others can walk into the space that you're creating there for as they're in their development or in their delivery of this authority that you're delegating. But it also requires you to have place like importance in permission and parameter setting as well. So the people are really clear on where the expectation is, and that balancing act around trust doesn't need to be high stakes. Actually, if you can get the right balance around like permission setting as well, then you can enable people to be really clear on where the parameters are for what of where you're expecting them to step up or step into, and where's beyond that. What's the space in which you want them to have the authority so that they can deliver.
Yeah. There's a couple of things that you've just sort of set my head racing on. One I think makes me wonder if trust comes from, in lots of ways, through the credibility in your track record. So in order for me to trust you, to give you that delegated authority, you need to be credible in the sense that you've got a track record of doing what you say you were going to do. So I do wonder whether, or I had a thought that I wonder if delegated tasks are the kind of gateway drug to delegated authority. So you kind of, you give people a range of tasks that you think are either within their capability or just beyond. You see how they respond to that. And the more that you're confident as a leader that, people will do what they say they're going to do and they'll do it successfully, that becomes the permission step to go, okay, I'm going to give that person permission because I trust them and they're credible in my eyes. And that's a kind of, if people are thinking, well, how do I go from maybe early days or not giving away much of this authority to doing this? I think there's a kind of middle step or a first step, and that would be delegate some important stuff and set some parameters around that. And I can talk to that a little bit more if that's helpful, but because I think there might be, that might be useful for people rather than just dive straight in to delegated authority. And as you said, you need to set some parameters around it.
Absolutely. It's like breadcrumbing, right? Like creating just little by level, creating a little bit more space for people to step up into, but also being really, firstly, active in how you're thinking about that process with your people, so that you're, consistently challenging yourself to expand the parameters that you allow people to operate within, and being really honest with yourself around how you're going about doing that. Because often the barrier towards this, like we spoke about before, is, we need to relinquish control and step out from spaces in order to enable people to step up into their leadership in those spaces that we've just created for them. And so in order for us to be systematic, if you like, around how we're doing that, we need to be really intentional with our approach to developing the leaders around us, developing that sort of delegated authority as a function of the team. And often an important place to start with for any teams or any individuals questioning what's preventing maybe people from stepping up. I've been explicit with the expectation that I set, but I'm still not seeing that the behavior, is asking yourself or asking others around you to be honest with where do they what behaviors do they see from you that are supportive of that, of the trust that they're going to be backed to step up into a space that is maybe uncomfortable or unfamiliar, requires a bit of a leap of faith. But also, are there any behaviors that you might demonstrate that might erode that faith or that trust, which are preventing people from stepping up or stepping in to the space that you're encouraging or trying to encourage?
I agree with that totally. It will lead us into another topic that I know we have as a podcast episode further down the line about followership, and how to be a great follower is a really important skill, actually, which I think lots of people could do with learning. But it does also bring the other side to your argument or your position, which is, yes, it might be something that the leader's doing, but just because you want to give ownership to people doesn't mean they're going to take it. And the best you can do is create, as you've alluded to, the environment where people can take ownership. That just because you want to give it to them doesn't necessarily mean they're going to take it. So I do think you need to do all the self-reflective things you've just talked about in terms of your behaviors as a leader, but then you might need to put your coaching hat on and go, how do I help this person step in? How do I help them, have the confidence to take on a task that they may think is beyond their capability, but I don't, and as the leader. So I think there's a kind of at least two parts to that, which is, yes, the role of the leader and how they're approaching it, but also how is the person being given that responsibility and that delegated authority responding to that too.
Absolutely. I always think on that second topic, there's the coaching and the guidance. There's also the directive approach, right, which is about being really explicit with the expectation. I often think of this topic as part of like a leadership system, right? And actually, in order to be really effective with encouraging people to step into that fold, precision, I think, is really a key skill there. Precision in what you communicate and how you communicate it. And there's the system at play that I often think about is like why, what, and how. And what I mean when I talk about that is within, really precise expectation setting for anyone, whether it's task or, creating space for authority, any delegation, being really clear with the why around, direction of travel or the objective at play, or, whatever the context is that people need to understand in order for them to step into the fold. So in this context, if we're talking about delegated authority, why it's incumbent for your people to step up into the responsibility that you're asking, or expecting of them. Also to be really explicit with what is a good outcome, what is the behavior that you'd be expecting to see, or what is the outputs that you'd expect them to be responsible for delivering, and being, again, really explicit with what good looks like on that front, and then contracting or co-creating with them the how, right? So actually, if it's like a big step from where they are to the kind of challenges or problems that you're asking them to solve, they might need a bit more guidance around how they go about doing that. It might be that they're really, they're super credible and you trust them, immensely, and the how is, completely within their bag to craft and create with autonomy and ownership, and they just needed the permission, if you like, around why and what, and they can solve for the how. But really, as a really simple model, being very explicit and precise around what the delta is between where they are and where you would like them to be performing, so that, again, you're creating the conditions then for that sort of authority to be owned and stepped into, and those parameters around where, what the difference is between where they're at and where you'd like them to be.
Yeah, I have to say that's probably one of the areas that I most frequently get wrong when I'm delegating authority myself, which is because I'm very high on trust. I kind of, I wouldn't say I'm laissez-faire as a leader. I'd like to hear what's going on and want to know what's going on. But I'm very quick to delegate authority. But I don't think I often spend as much time as I could or should doing the crystallizing the what. And I'm assuming that if I'm delegating authority to you, you know how to do it anyway. So I'll kind of let you go. And I think that the challenge, I know there are probably all sorts of reasons, and maybe we should have a coaching conversation live on air, and we can explore that together. But I do honestly believe it's partly because I have very high trust, and I kind of expect the people that I'm delegating sort of authority to create the vision for themselves, because well, your world better than I do. You create it, and sometimes that's caught me out because I've not spent enough time being precise in the way that you've just described it. So I think that's a really helpful aid and tool for people to think about, or at least a lens through which to look at that delegation. Are you doing that with enough thoroughness for the benefit of both parties? It might take you a little bit longer as a leader, but you're going to have to pick up fewer pieces, I'm guessing, further down the line if you've done a better job up front. So you're investing a bit more time up front to save you some time further down the line.
Well, that's absolutely. So, I mean, it's brilliant to have trust in those around you, right? Like often, actually, that's the pitfall, is like low trust, and therefore people don't step into delegated authority. But what you're describing there is the shadow to that, the flip side to that, right? And I think the explicit and precise conversation around the what up front is additionally has the benefit of reducing ambiguity. Which then allows for that trust to be, paid back, if you like, because there's less risk of, the behavior that drives towards the outcome, like not being aligned with expectations, right? It's really useful to just align on expectations up front. Yes, to pay it forward so that there's less, having to capture that later, but also to avoid the risk of eroding delegated authority later. There's nothing worse than saying, I fully trust you, go ahead and do it. And then, once it's been done, then coming back to say, well, actually, this isn't quite right, that's not quite right. And then, having to spend the time then to sort of course correct, because then it runs the risk of, eroding that, authority. And then next time you come back, it's, potentially you've taken a step back around, the likelihood of that person to step into the fold, because they've learned from last time that actually that wasn't the best way to approach it.
Yeah. Oh, and indeed that actually that trust is eroded through no fault of their own necessarily. It's just you as the leader didn't give them the right situations and set the right context for them to succeed. I'm not saying you set out to do that purposely. It's just you didn't.
Correct.
So I think so. We spent some time looking at what creates delegated authority and what needs to be in place, and we talked about trust, and we talked about credibility and permission, and setting up with precision. Really important. You mentioned this idea of eroding delegated authority, and some of that might come around by a poor setup. Let's call it that. What else? In your experience, you've worked with loads of leaders, what do you see erodes that delegated authority, maybe from both sides, but most typically, I guess, from the leader's perspective?
Yeah. I mean, partly is what we were just spoke about, right? Like, actually, if we run the risk, if we don't set it up correctly at the outset, and then we have to, maybe be slightly less consistent with the message that we shared before, whereas the message before was, I trust you, go ahead and deliver this. And then, later on, it's the signal maybe around course correction is actually, I don't trust you as much as I might suggested. Yeah. Then, it's really, it can be fragile in that respect, because at that point, they've maybe, taken a bit of a risk in stepping into the fold and driving it, and the cost of that has been actually, now don't feel as trusted in this environment. The next time they find themselves, with the same opportunity, that, opportunity to step forward might be less appealing. And, people learn from past experiences, of course. And so, it can be really fragile in that respect. Not by intent, ultimately you've got outcomes that need to be delivered, and, it is necessary to, give feedback or course correct or whatever it might be. But it's certainly in moments where we've asked people to, take a risk in stepping into more responsibility, it can be particularly fragile in that moment. So it's really important to just hold that in good faith, and acknowledge and recognize that actually, it's really important to get this right, because there's a risk around it if we get it wrong. I think the other thing that's quite obviously that can erode it is the kind of possibility of, blame. If they don't quite get it right, and then feel, there's a backlash or a blame around that, that they haven't been backed to when they took the risk to step into slightly more authority. Of course, that's the quickest way in which you can sort of erode the chances of people feeling, brave enough to step into more responsibility when, they're being encouraged to do it. So that's a very...
I agree with that. I think it speaks to the idea that, if you're going to delegate authority to some extent, while you're not looking for failure, and I use that word in air quotes, I think there's something you've got to be comfortable enough that it might not go as you want it to. But and I think the problem is, if you're not okay, don't delegate that authority, or stay closer to it than you might want to as a leader. But you can't just give somebody free rein that it goes wrong for whatever reason, and whoever's, again, fault, let's call it that, or responsibility. But if you're not comfortable with that, and then you keep, it goes wrong once, and then you never give delegated authority again because you can't risk it. And I think you've got to be comfortable with whatever the level of likelihood that it could fail is, and mitigate that in whatever way you can. And more regular check-ins, clearer set of of instructions, as you pointed out at the beginning. Getting somebody to repeat those instructions. I don't mean like a school child, that's really patronizing, but give me a plan based on what we've talked about. Give me a plan and some timelines and some deliverables. Have the milestones kind of idea, so that it's never going to go so far off track that delegated authority isn't, you've got authority, I'll see you in a year's time. When you think about our conversation with Keith Antoine, for example, elite athletes don't meet their coach once every 4 years. They're meeting them on a weekly basis to make sure they stay on track, right? So I think there's something about the level of comfort with, I won't call it failure, things going off track or not being delivered as they ideally would.
Well, you're bang on, right? Like it's a risk when leadership, fundamentally, there's risk inherent in all of it, because you're responsible for outcomes, but you're not the person who's delivering those outcomes. So all of the scaffolding, the structures that you just described to kind of mitigate where those risks exist, it's really important, of course, to manage that, to be aware of that and to manage that. I think the critical part, or the critical consideration there is, are you doing that? Are you evaluating, where the risk is inherent in certain tasks and relinquishing certain controls in order to, realize the benefit of people learning, new skills and developing, leaders around you, and rather than just doing it by default. Every task or every situation has a high degree of control because ultimately it's my name that's responsible for this, and I've got my reputation or whatever it might be, and so I'm not willing to relinquish any of that. We see that. I see that often in when this is true, right? And actually that could be a cultural consideration that there feels like there's a high degree of blame as a culture, and so the natural response of all leaders is to tighten up controls, and therefore there's less room for growth to happen, because failure is not in itself a bad thing. I think we tend to associate that with a negative connotation. Of course, ideally success is present everywhere and always, but in failure there is opportunity to learn and grow, and so it's really important that we're creating spaces for where failure could happen, because ultimately then that's a function of development. I'm not going to butcher a phrase because I can't remember it exactly, but they're ultimately the organizations that grow the fastest, or individuals that grow the fastest too, are just those that have tried more things. You've gone through more iterations, more cycles of experimentation and failure, and as a result you've landed at what works, and that's the quickest lubricant to accelerating growth. So it's that is
failed fast, right?
Fail fast, precisely.
Yeah, and but get back on the horse really quickly, and look, I think the most important thing is, and we'll talk about this, I think we have talked about it, but we'll just come back to it again and again and again, which is where it is that learning cycle. Have you got the learning cycle that says, we wanted to do this, we've ended up with this, what have we learned as a result, and how do we get better next time, so that you're not making the same mistake twice? But to your point, you're not trying to avoid all mistakes. You kind of are, but you accept that they will happen.
And you mitigate for them, right, in the ways in which you describe, but you allow for the room and the space for learning and development and growth, and delegated authority, growth in authority to show itself.
Sorry, go on. No, I was just thinking that you used the word earlier on, which I really it really resonated for me, which was this idea of fragile, this delegated authority thing being quite fragile. And I think it both is and should be in some respects. And what I mean by that is that actually you should be handling it as a leader carefully. I don't think it will break, but I think you should be thinking about it could backfire if I don't have all the things we've talked about in the last 25, 30 minutes in place to make it robust. And how do you make it anti-fragile? You make it anti-fragile by putting in, all the mitigants that we've just talked about, which I think would help. I just want to we've got a couple of minutes left. I just want to talk about the person that's authority is being delegated to. How do they handle that well? And maybe how do they expand into that space comfortably without looking like they're trying to land grab or empire build, for example? Just maybe a couple of heads up for leaders to maybe when they're scanning how their team are responding to delegated authority, what are the indicators that somebody's taken that on well, that added responsibility?
I have the belief that it's really important for everyone to be very active around their own development, which is to say, not necessarily like jockeying for position, but just being very explicit with the directions that you want to travel in. And if you feel, equipped to take on more responsibility in certain, context or wherever it might be, to earn the trust of those, around you, above you, but also to be explicit around where you feel, ready to step into the next level for your career, of your leadership, of your development. So I feel like it's a function of like really effective contracting, explicit around where you want to have opportunity, where you feel ready to have opportunity, and also, of course, earning that trust and demonstrating the credibility through, your day-to-day behaviors. I think that's the core of it. And if you can sense that there is a reticence or a potential, trust blocker, to also be explicit around that, actually what if I feel like I'm not having the authority delegated to me that I'm ready for, have an honest conversation to explore, what's getting in the way of that. Like, what do you need to demonstrate in order to earn or reduce that earn the trust, or reduce that as a blocker? That would be where I would focus.
Yeah, agreed. I've often spoken to people who are in exactly that position where they're eager for more responsibility, to be given, greater opportunity, but it's not coming. And my view is you can put your energy elsewhere. And what I mean by that is you don't have to only exercise your capabilities inside the organization that pay your salary. It would be lovely that you can, but actually go away, go lead something in your community, go lead a project outside of work. A, you'll get the experience that you're not getting inside work, but B, if it's something that, this sounds a horror, I really don't like this phrase, but I'm using it just for effect today. It boosts your CV so that actually if you're then looking for opportunities outside of that business, you're able to say, look, this is what I've done inside the organization I'm currently with. And by the way, here's all the things I've done outside, and here are the skills that, I've developed on, in a sense, off my own back. To your point, I think you have to proactively look for those opportunities, both inside and maybe outside, if you're not being given that. Yeah, I think that's great. I think that's a really good place to stop there, Nejmi, because I think, there'll be other podcast episodes that we know are going to be focused on the follower side of this equation. So there's plenty more where that came from. I think we've covered what I hope listeners will feel is a really useful next part of this idea of both leading, stepping in and stepping out, but also creating the opportunities for people to step up through this idea of delegated authority, why you would bother to do it at all, how you set about doing it, some of the watch outs to ensure that you're not eroding it, and how recipients can really sort of flex into it, I guess.
Yeah, I love that. As a closing thought, to earn authority, demonstrate it. That's what I took from what you just suggested.
Love that. That could be a meme somewhere, a t-shirt maybe. Hey, brilliant. Look, until the next time, really enjoyed that as always. I hope listeners have got a lot from it. We'll put some show notes together and we'll link to both the preceding episode, which I would strongly recommend people go and listen to, and also Keith Antoine's part as well, episode as well, because I think there's some really good points in there that people, if you think about how you can become a high performer and get more delegated authority, the whole of last year actually was about high performance. So, there are plenty of episodes there for you to go and listen to, and we would strongly recommend you do that. Until the next time, thanks, sir. See you soon. Keep well.
Likewise. Thanks. Bye.